California Dreaming is brought to you by Blueberry. You know, there is a little bit more to making a podcast than just talking into a mic and hitting publish. You need more than that. And I'm talking about a reliable hosting service so your time can be spent working on your show. You also want accurate download numbers, you want to see the audience that you're reaching, and you're going to want a webpage that is simple and easy to work with. That's why I choose Blueberry. With its simple media hosting and fully integrated WordPress website, it can't get any easier. So if you host a show or if you're thinking about starting one, visit www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to give Blueberry a try for a month for free. Blueberry's support team will be right there every step of the way to help you migrate over so you won't lose any of your subscribers in the process. And if you're brand new to this, they can get your new show up and running. And with a month for free to try it out using promo code DREAM, what have you got to lose? There are a number of ways that you can support California Dreaming. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can spread the word about the show. You can recommend us in podcast and true crime fan groups. And you can leave the show a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you listen to the show on. And if you would like to help out a little bit more, you can support the show on our Patreon. You can gain access to at least one exclusive episode per month, and there are currently more than 50 episodes that you can binge. So it is a good deal starting at just $1. In addition, there are about 8 premium episodes available for supporters at the $5 and above tiers. This week, I'd like to thank Heather A., Kevin A., Lee C., Catherine S., and Mandy W. for joining Patreon, and also Mandy K. and Janelle H. for raising their pledges to the next tier. If you are unable to sign up for a monthly subscription to Patreon, you can help with a one-time donation to our show through our PayPal using our email, californiapod@gmail.com. Every little bit helps in keeping California Dreaming moving forward as well as ad-free. So thank you. Recently, I was looking at some videos on Facebook Watch, and a story caught my attention that directed me to a podcast called The Brilliant Idiots Podcast. I had not listened to it before, and it's been in production since 2014, so they've been around for a little while. I mean, full disclosure, my range of genres is pretty limited to true crime and more true crime. And I rarely listen to comedy podcasts, though I do occasionally will listen to some comedy true crime ones, very occasionally. And I'll also listen to some recommendations that you listening throw out there sometimes. So the show has 2 hosts, Charlemagne the God and Andrew Schultz. They are the Brilliant Idiots, and each week, according to their show description, they explore the issues of the day in a style that is often idiotic, sometimes brilliant, and always hysterical. The episode that I sought out was from back in January of 2018 and is entitled Men Too. The show notes says that they discuss sexual consent, the hashtag Men Too movement, and Andrew gets some things off his chest about the Aziz Ansari situation. Their guest for this particular episode was a woman named Jazz Waters, and I'll tell you a little bit about her background in a moment. She was there to discuss the moment that changed her life, writing for TV, and more. Jazz Waters is also known as Jazz Fly, but we'll simply call her Jazz. Jazz is best known for her work as a staff writer on the NBC show This Is Us and Showtime's Kidding. She was also a writer for the 2019 film What Men Want, and she also has a handful of other credits to her name, as well as credits as a second unit director and assistant director on film projects. At the time that she was a guest on The Brilliant Idiots, she was 37 years old and was most definitely making her mark in Hollywood, very much an up-and-coming writer in the industry. The episode was more than 2 hours long, so in order to get to the part that I was particularly looking for, I needed to fast forward for a while. But I do intend to go back and listen to her again when I have more time, because she did have some interesting and insightful things to share. I'm going to tell you about one of them, the story that I looked for specifically for this episode. Almost an hour and a half into their conversation, one of the hosts brought up the fact that Jazz has a criminal record. And, I'm not sure if they sprung that on her or if she was going to be completely open and candid about it before they started and they said that they would talk about it. But it kind of sort of sounded like maybe they caught her off guard or the segue wasn't as smooth as we think segues in podcasts might go. But yeah, one of them brought it up and asked her if she was comfortable talking about it. And she said, well, yeah, technically I'm a convicted felon. Jazz is originally from the Chicago area, so they automatically and jokingly assumed that she shot somebody. But no, it was hardly that serious. Putting it all into context, Jazz needed to go back a few years. She discussed where her career had its beginnings, working as a production assistant on the TV show ER, while working on countless other projects, commercials, movies, television shows, things of that sort. And all of this was back in Chicago. So she eventually made her first move to the Los Angeles area in order to further her career in the TV and film industry. Now, I am going to try to figure out around what year all of this happened to take place, because she never exactly said when, but it was in the mid to late 2000s, somewhere between 2007 and 2009. That is my best guess based on what she had to say. So when Jazz arrived in California, she had 2 job offers. One was a position as an associate producer on a show on the Spice Channel, which you may know is an adult content channel with sexually explicit shows. And the second job offer was an internship that was unpaid for actor Eric LaSalle, best known for his starring role as Dr. Peter Benton on ER, which is how Jazz became acquainted with him in the first place when she was working on that show. So she decided to take the unpaid position, determined to work her way up. Eventually, she earned a paid position as an office assistant, then she was promoted to office manager, then executive assistant, and finally, client executive. So Jazz said at the time, Eric was still a really big name and influential person in Hollywood, and she described herself as being young, somewhat naive, and as I'm trying to work the time frame here for this period of time, it puts her into her early to mid 20s. And on the podcast, she said she really had no idea who she was as a person yet. And when you give a young person that much power and that much access, it's easy for things to get out of hand. At the same time, even though she had this fancy title of client executive, she was hardly making the kinds of money you would think she'd be making after climbing through the ranks. Her salary for that position, she said, was $21,000 a year, which is not a great salary, no matter when in the new millennium this took place, especially as a single adult living in the Los Angeles area. So it was said on the podcast, when you have the combination of a job position where you have a certain level of power and access, coupled with a pretty low salary, it can be a recipe for disaster. On top of that, Jazz described the work environment in the office as an unhealthy one. It was a company ran by one person and one person alone, and that was Eric LaSalle. And Jazz felt as though that the feeling that everybody in the company, all of the employees, were like a family, that whole sentiment was disingenuous. Like on the surface, everyone says and acts and appears to be tight-knit in the work environment, but the reality was that it wasn't like that at all. And she even went so far to say that the industry, the entertainment industry as a whole, that's how things are. That's the way things go. Everything is pretty shallow and superficial. How much truth there is in that statement, I personally can't say. I would have no idea what it's like behind the scenes, what the dynamic is like, but this is her personal experience, at least to this point in her life. These are some of the hard knocks that you have to go through. learning things as you go along. After a while, you become more savvy. You develop a thicker skin working in the world of entertainment. And as a result of these experiences, Jazz will say, she does not throw around the terms family and friends very loosely. She doesn't take those labels lightly anymore because when you proclaim yourself to be a tight-knit family, then responsibilities to that come into play. And that whole entire concept in this particular company that she was working for was a completely false sense of family and camaraderie. Eventually, Jazz and Eric, their working relationship began to have a falling out. As he was in the role of a mentor, she felt as though there was a clear time that she should have left before things really got bad, which ended up turning into yet another lesson for her. Know when it's time to just go, to move on. Take those hints and take those cues and run. She said that they were battling for control over her. She didn't expand on that much or what she meant by that, so we can interpret that whichever way we can. The fact is, I've never worked in an executive office type situation either. I've never had to answer to some sort of supreme boss like that. But I imagine these Hollywood actor types can be kind of diva-ish, so I've heard. Demanding, difficult, overbearing, controlling. That's kind of what I'm imagining here, but I can't say for sure. So, as this job seemed to be running its course, Jazz got the news that her younger sister was expecting. And the family, from what she described, wasn't exactly thrilled about this. It kind of sounded like her sister was a little bit too young or not prepared for the responsibility of motherhood. But anyway, Jazz went ahead and used her company credit card to purchase things for her sister and the baby that was coming as those needs arose. Her sister would come and say that she needed this, she needed that, she needed the other, and Jazz was like, well, I'll just use the card and I'll pay it back, no problem. But before long, her spending on the card just got to the point where it was too much for her to be able to pay back. And when all was said and done, Jazz had run up about $4,000 on the card. Now, when she said $4,000, the hosts of the podcast were like, well, that's not all that bad. You know, fancy company, big actor, corporate job. I mean, for most, if not all, Hollywood actors with a prolific career, $4,000 isn't all that much money. But Jazz did point out to them, yeah, that may not seem like a big deal, but when you consider that $4,000, well, she said in the interview that it was a quarter of her salary. I figured it to be a little less than a fifth of her salary. And at the rate that Jazz was getting paid, it would have taken her more than 2 months to earn $4,000, almost 2.5 months. So if you've got a boss that has you working at the level of client executive, whatever that even means, and is only paying you $21,000, he's not going to just thumb his nose at $4,000. Clearly, the company is tight with money when it comes to the executive staff. And in Jazz's world, in her upbringing, with her background, she was just never around that kind of money. So she said $4,000 may as well have been $40,000. And then she posed the question, is $4,000 a lot of money to Eric LaSalle? Well, dreamers, I basically just called him a tightwad, but she said no, that really isn't a lot of money in his world. But regardless of the relativeness of what $4,000 means to Jazz and what it means to Eric, it didn't matter. She was fired from her job, and she was heartbroken, at least at the beginning of all this. So the host asked her, did he press charges? She said he did. And she wasn't going to say anything about that or him. She did what she did, and she takes responsibility for it. However he felt about it then, how he would feel about it now, that's his to own. But for Jazz, she did say that it would turn out to be one of the best things to happen to her in her life. And it would lead to what they alluded to in the show notes, that moment that would change her life. After she was fired, Jazz found work at MTV for a little while and then Nickelodeon. But then she started becoming pretty jaded about the whole idea of being in Hollywood. I believe the word she used was disenfranchised. And she reached a point where she decided that she needed to go home to Chicago to be close to her family and to lean on them for support. So losing her job with Eric LaSalle really left her feeling subjugated and overwhelmed with pursuing her career, at least there in California. So Jazz had a job lined up with an insurance company back in Illinois in an effort to hopefully get back to some semblance of normalcy while she figured out what her next move in life was going to be. And part of what Jazz needed to do was to sublet her Los Angeles apartment before she could head back home. She had a number of appointments to meet with some potential people to sublet the place on one particular day. She was finished with that, so she thought, when she got another knock at the door. It turned out to be a pair of detectives. They showed her their badges and they asked to speak to her. At first, it hadn't dawned on her what they were there for. She started thinking maybe she had some warrants for some moving violations that she had failed to pay the fines on. And they were like, "No, do you know who Eric LaSalle is?" And she said, "Yeah, that's my former boss." Well, they told her that he was alleging that she embezzled $20,000 from his company. Now, in the moment, Jazz wasn't going to come back with anything about the $4,000, but she was ready to explain that that isn't what's going on here, thinking that they were going to discuss the matter, but no, they were there to arrest her. She spent the night in jail and went to see the judge the next morning. And it was a very surreal experience because she would say never would she have imagined herself in a situation like this. And she said this is when the education started. Because the whole ordeal, when you first get arrested, she says, is like you get put into different rooms with other women who are too facing some sort of legal trouble, obviously, going through some of the same things that Jazz was going through. People from all different places, all different backgrounds, and with little to nothing else to do but just wait, conversations started. So on the podcast, Jazz talked about one girl who was in there the night that she was arrested, who had been moved around with her to at least 3 different holding areas. Jazz said it was fairly obvious to her that this particular girl was brought in on charges related to sex work, and this was clearly not this girl's first rodeo. The officers or the deputies, I believe these jails are run by the Los Angeles County Sheriffs, they brought this girl in and out of the holding cell a couple of times, and then there was this one particular time when she was brought back in that Jazz could see that she had been crying pretty hard. This girl laid down across the bench and just started crying some more. And nobody was really talking to this girl. Eventually, one of the ladies in the cell went to go talk to her to find out what happened. But just as suddenly as the woman got up to talk to her, she got kind of irritated, almost disgusted, and she was like, "F you then," and took a seat back next to Jazz. And Jazz was like, "What's going on? Is she okay? Does she need a hug? What's up?" And the woman said to Jazz, "No, this bitch is done." And Jazz asked, "What do you mean?" Well, as it turned out, the last time that this girl had been arrested, the time prior to this, she was also arrested for sex work at that time, and it turned out she tested positive for HIV. So this time, when she was taken into custody, still doing sex work, while knowing that she's HIV positive, the charges that she was then facing were much worse: attempted murder. And along with that comes the possibility of as many as 10 years in prison, as opposed to a citation or an infraction for sex work. So this girl, who appeared to be quite young, was in a lot of trouble, facing much more serious charges. And from what I understand to be the laws in California at the time and continue to be at this day, If this is going to be a first strike or a second strike or even a third, the sentence is going to be doubled on the second and 25 to life on the third. The parameters of those laws have been reviewed in recent years when it comes to third strike nonviolent felonies, but at this point in time, this woman could be potentially facing a lot of time in prison if she had any other prior felony convictions. So Jazz is looking at this girl who she estimates to be about 19 or 20 years old, and she's thinking, not only is this young person having to deal with the fact that she's HIV positive, but there has got to be all sorts of other things going on in her life where she's resorting to sex work. And on top of that, she's probably going to go to jail for a long time. Very young with a lot on her plate. So, dreamers, as I'm listening to Jazz recount the story, she's probably getting a really good perspective on things as she's sitting there in this cell, considering what she's in there for, compared to what some of these other young people are in there for. It's very easy to see why Jazz saw this as her life-changing moment. And as Jazz sat there contemplating, she expressed her sympathy for the girl. And the other woman was like, no, F her. That's the girl that set up Romeo Santana. Okay, wait, what? Romeo Santana? I'll get back to that in a moment. Let me wrap up Jazz's story here first. So she said that this was the eye-opening event in her life, this encounter with this young woman. The next day, Jazz bonded out of jail. But at this point, when she was arrested, she was basically completely moved back to Chicago. So for the next year and a half, she was flying back and forth between Los Angeles and Chicago in order to make it to each of her court dates. She had her own attorney for a while with the small amount of money that she'd been able to save, but she ended up needing a public defender. And he told her, you know what, you're just going to have to take a deal. You're admitting to the $4,000, you're looking at 3 years, you're taking responsibility for some of it, so the best thing to do is to take a deal. What helped Jazz decide between taking a deal or rolling the dice on going to trial was the fact that the woman who raised her was her grandmother. And at the time that this was happening, Grandma was 87 years old. Going to prison for 3 years meant she might lose her while she was in. So Jazz took the deal, which would have her in county jail for 90 days and she'd be finished. So it would be 3 months in jail, 3 years of probation, and when it would be time for her to surrender herself into custody, she would have to come up with a check for $2,000, which she nor did anybody she knew in her circle of family or friends had anywhere close to being able to lend her. So she had those 3 months to come up with $2,000. At the time, Jazz was doing temp work in Chicago, and she was lucky if she was making $300 a week. So saving up $2,000 was just about impossible at this point in her life. If she didn't have the money, she was going to have to serve more than just the 90 days. So she went back to Chicago with this 3 months counting down on her. She hit everyone up that she knew for help with this $2,000, and everyone was like, I don't know where you're going to get this money, but I'm going to pray for you. Just like a broken record of prayers. And Jazz was like, I don't need prayers, I need money. And even with her dad being a minister, she went to the church telling them, I have to come up with this money, and all she was getting was more prayers. So finally, she turned to her dad and she told him, this praying for me crap is not helping me. And he said, yeah, that's because you're not praying. Everyone else is praying for you, and you're not praying for yourself. So the next morning, Jazz woke up and said a prayer. And she did it again the next morning, and then again the next. She repeated the same prayer over and over and over again. 2 weeks before Jazz was set to return to Los Angeles to turn herself in, one of her good friends, a childhood friend, reached out to her and said, I just got this credit card. I can get you a cash advance." And with that, the day before her flight to Los Angeles, Jazz was able to get the $2,000 from her friend. She flew back to Los Angeles, showed up for her sentencing. She submitted the check for $2,000 and prepared to be sentenced to 90 days. But her public defender is telling her, this is your first offense. This is not a violent crime. My best guess is you're going to be out in 30 days max. At the time, back in Chicago, Jazz had a job offer, and she was able to stall them for a month, telling them that she was having surgery and she would need that time to recover. So her hopes were riding on getting out in 30 days and getting back to her life. So Jazz gets on the bus and is being transported to the Women's County Jail, which is located in Linwood, California. You've probably seen the celebrities come and go from there over the years. Khloe Kardashian, Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan, Nicole Richie, just to name a few. So she arrived there. They had to be searched, and then they're given their jail uniforms and assigned to a bunk. Jazz took a top bunk because the woman that she was sharing a cell with was on the bottom and was coming down pretty hard from drugs. So she is just throwing up and really sick. In the conversations that Jazz had with some of the other ladies on her way in, she was told it would be a good idea to get herself involved in a work detail. It would help pass the time. So she decided that the next morning when they called out if anyone wanted to work, that she would go ahead and volunteer to do that. At 5 a.m, the guards came around and asked whoever wanted to work to come downstairs and get an assignment. So the jobs that they give to the inmates are based on how long you're going to be in the jail. So if you're going to be there for a longer period of time, you're going to be out in the field working. If you're going to be in for just a short period of time, then you're going to be assigned to the kitchen. Now remember, this is county jail. So short term would be a day or two. Long term would be what Jazz was in there for, the 90 days. But, she's thinking she's only there for 30, so she wants kitchen duty. And because those passing out the job assignments already know if you're short term or long term, they'll assign you accordingly automatically. So they called her name, she said she wanted to work, and they assigned her to the field. Jazz questioned the officer and told her that she was in for 30 days, and the officer looked down at her paperwork and said, 90 days, you go to the field, go back to your bunk. Jazz went back to her cell, laid down on her top bunk, and she had a breakdown as the realization started to set in that she was going to be in jail for 3 months. It may not seem like a lot considering the cases that we've discussed on this show, where defendants are sentenced to life terms, hundreds of years. Even when we've covered the Cleveland kidnapper Ariel Castro, he got 1,000 years. We've seen people sentenced to death. These people will tell you, I could do 90 days standing on my head. Well, for people who never envisioned themselves behind bars, being locked in what Jazz described as a cage for that long, it feels like an eternity. And for county jail, it is a never-ending revolving door of people. So every single day is different. Whereas if you're in prison, you get settled into your new life, and every single day can be exactly the same for years and years on end. And Jazz here is really feeling out of her element, though she is quickly able to figure out what she needs to do and how she needs to be in order to get by. So no, she could not have ever imagined herself in this place, but she's at least tried to prepare herself as much as possible. But the reality of 90 days in this particular moment just overwhelmed her. On her bunk, laying there crying, Jazz decided to go back to praying and talking to God. If this is what you want me to do, if this is where I need to be, then so be it. I'm with you. And in the next moment, as she says it, she surrendered everything to God. From there, she decided she was just going to rest. to sleep as much as she could in order for these 3 months to go by. But then, like an hour later, she was getting moved around again and placed into different holding areas, talking to other women there. Then she was getting moved again and told to stand on some yellow tape. She could hear some of the officers along the way say, "They're going out." So Jazz started wondering, where are we going? Are they sending us to another facility? And soon she gets moved again and again and yet again to another holding area. Officers finally came in and handed Jazz and everyone else in that area a bag with their clothing in it, the clothing that they were wearing when they came in. And everyone started putting on their clothes really quickly, but at the same time, they can't really ask any questions, so Jazz is totally confused. Another 2 hours passes, and Jazz is wearing her regular clothes. They all get moved to an area where they are being issued release forms. And she's like, okay, I'm liking where this is going. They all get moved again. They walk out this door, which is kind of like a garage door, where the bus they came in on entered the facility in the first place. And at the end of that garage was a door that was an exit to the free world. And they were all released. So all in all, Jazz served 24 hours. Lindsay Lohan was sentenced there for 90 days and served 14. Paris Hilton was sentenced to 45 days and served 13. So Jazz was pretty lucky. All 3 of them were released because of overcrowding. Jazz was asked what her prayer was, and it was pretty simple. And she shared that she has said it to herself every single morning since that time. Thank you for waking me up this morning. Thank you for allowing me to see another day, another opportunity to do better, to be better. I ask that you continue to bless myself and my family, help us to accomplish our goals, come into our hearts and into our minds, bless our lives, help us to be honest and live to our potential, protect us from anything not of you. The experience, Jazz said, was the ultimate lesson in humility, that you have power over nothing and to make yourself small in the face of God. When Jazz got back to Chicago, of course, everyone was surprised and pleasantly surprised, I'm sure, to see her. But she said that her life was not the same anymore, that she began to trust in those prayers that she had shot down in her search for the $2,000. To trust in him, and that in turn allow for her to trust in herself more than she did in the past. That now she knew that if she ever took any chances, any leaps of faith, that if for some reason if she failed, that she would be okay. And since then, Jazz has said that she felt that God has been on her side and in her corner countless times since, and has been fearless when taking the biggest of chances. She's not just sitting there hoping for miracles, but she's expecting miracles to happen. And if the miracles don't happen for her, then she has those lessons to learn from. That she learned that the world isn't all about you. Whether it's the good things or the bad things that happen, we take lessons from the process, from those experiences. And in the conversation, the host did want to point out, as I do want to point out to you listening as well, that these processes do not have to be rooted in God or religion, but rather we can take what Jazz is saying here and see it through our own individual lenses, with or without it. The principles can very much still be applied. The humility, being humble, knowing that there is always something or someone bigger than you out there. So dreamers, if you decide to go and check out this podcast, understand that it is a comedy podcast. They can be vulgar. The jokes can be a little crude here and there. I picked the parts of Jazz's conversation that I wanted to share with you that I found the most interesting and intriguing. And I'm not quite finished telling you Jazz's story. I'm going to revisit her life towards the end of this episode. But where I do want to go from here is to share with you the story of the person that she named in the middle of all of this whole ordeal that she faced back at this time in her life. She named Romeo Santana. Some of you may recognize the name right away. Some of you may not, and that's okay. This was a long time ago, and this wasn't actually the young man's real name. Well, at least half of it anyway. The other half is his TV character, and I'm going to tell you all about him and his life and career in this 159th episode of California Dreaming, the tale of lies that kill. In the middle of our conversation about her experience working for actor Eric LaSalle, Jazz mentioned the young woman the night she first was arrested, the one who was HIV positive. If you recall, another woman in the cell told Jazz to forget that bitch or whatever she said. She's the one who set up Romeo Santana. Before I get to what she meant by that, let me tell you who Romeo Santana was. Some of you, like I said, may already know, but for those of you who don't, Romeo Santana was a character on The Steve Harvey Show, which is a sitcom that ran from 1996 through 2002. Steve Harvey played Steve Hightower, a music legend from the 1970s turned music teacher and vice principal at a high school in Chicago. His character forms a bond with two of his students, Romeo Santana and Stanley Kuznocki, played by Merlin Santana and William Lee Scott, respectively. Our story today evolves around Merlin, who, when he was cast in the role of Romeo, a wealthy, fashionable, trendy, kind of full of himself ladies' man student at the high school, he wanted to keep part of his real-life identity connected to his on-screen identity, so his character was given his real last name. So the Romeo Santana Jazz referred to is a character played by Merlin Santana. And yes, like the wizard from the Welsh literature, Merlin, the magician. The Steve Harvey Show was not Merlin's first stint on television, but it was by far his most prominent and longest running, having been one of the main stars for all 6 seasons. He made his television debut in 1991 at the age of 15 on the sitcom Major Dad. From there, he was on an episode of Law & Order, but then he got his first big break later that same year when he landed the role of Stanley on The Cosby Show, playing the role of Rudy Huxtable's boyfriend. But Merlin's career began long before that. Let's go back and start from his early life, from the beginning. Merlin was born March 14, 1976, to parents who were immigrants from the Dominican Republic, having settled in New York City. He was born prematurely, and his mother, Leah, said that doctors told her that her son had a 50-50 chance of survival. And if he did survive, then she could consider herself the mother of a miracle baby. So with that in mind, Leah gave him the name of the mythical wizard Merlin, and it was a name that Leah said her son truly embraced. When Merlin was about 3 years old, Leah met a talent agent who immediately recognized something unique in him that stood out. He had a very jovial, outgoing personality and a great sense of humor, very much so for a young kid. He had a magnetic personality, and he loved making people smile and laugh. So the agent told Mom, "There's this audition for a TV commercial. You should take him and try out for the part." So she took the advice and brought Merlin in for the audition, and he landed the part. After that, according to Leah, the commercial work was pretty much nonstop, which she was more than happy to have him doing, as was Merlin. He really liked being in commercials. Of course, he liked being able to earn money. He kind of liked the attention too, but Merlin's brother said that no matter what, he always stayed grounded and he always stayed true to himself and to his family. The fact was Merlin was being raised in a pretty rough area, the Washington Heights borough of Manhattan. Like in our last episode where I talked about Dorchester, Massachusetts, I said the only people who could truly speak on a city or a neighborhood would be those who lived it. So I can only tell you what I find online. And what I found online does not paint a pretty picture of Washington Heights during the time that Merlin was being raised. In the 1980s and into the 90s, New York City was in the throes of a crack cocaine epidemic, and Washington Heights was the second largest area in terms of drug distribution in that part of the United States, second only to Harlem. And with that, the neighborhood gained a reputation not only for the drugs, but also the gang violence that went along with it. In an article in the New York Times in 1989, Washington Heights was referred to as the crack capital of America. The precinct that patrols that neighborhood alone saw 103 murders, 1,130 felonies, 1,919 robberies, and 2,647 burglaries in 1990 alone. The reasons why Washington Heights became the epicenter of the drug crisis at the time was twofold. One was the fact that the George Washington Bridge allowed for easy access into the neighborhood by those who came into the area from the suburbs. Those who wanted to come and buy cocaine but didn't want to have to travel through the roughest parts of Washington Heights in order to get their drugs. It was easy in and easy out. The second was that drug trafficking into New York was being controlled by the Colombians, but the Dominicans controlled the drug sales in the South Bronx and Upper Manhattan. So with the way the area was laid out, Washington Heights became a territorial battleground because of its predominantly Dominican population. Plain and simple, New York City was facing a massive drug problem, and Washington Heights was one of the primary theaters of war. Merlin's mom, desperate to keep her son off the streets, immersed him in acting as soon as she realized that there was something very special about him. Since that time, and throughout the 90s to the present time, the community has improved and has gone through gentrification beginning in the 2000s, which not everyone is happy about because that comes with increased rent and the desire for higher-end businesses and luxury developments. So essentially, those who fought for years to save the neighborhood would end up being pushed out because the cost of living in the area became unaffordable. Anyway, at the time, Merlin was growing up, being a teen in the 80s and into the 90s. That was his world. But his mom did all she could to shield him from it, and acting was their way of accomplishing that. By the time Merlin was about 13 years old, his schedule was so busy, he finally had to tell his agent, you know what, we got to cut something out. So it was decided that he would focus solely on the stage work that he was getting and the TV shows. In 1990, Merlin had a starring role in a play off-Broadway called Hey Little Walter. And it just so happened that the now disgraced actor and convicted sexual predator, Bill Cosby, who at the time was a very much beloved figure on television, so much so that he used to be called America's Dad, it just so happened that he was in the audience at one of Merlin's performances. And he was so impressed by his performance that he wanted him for a part in his show. It was still in production at the time. It had originally been filmed in NBC studios in Brooklyn, but later on moved to Kaufman Astoria Studios in Queens. But anyway, Merlin landed the role of Stanley, which Bill Cosby actually wrote specifically for him. And he was to be the boyfriend of the youngest of the Huxtable children, Rudy. Merlin was in a total of 7 episodes, but that was definitely his first big break, The Cosby Show being one of the biggest hits at the time. When Merlin's run with The Cosby Show ended, he was cast in a role on a new sitcom called Getting By. I had not heard of the show, and it only lasted for 2 seasons. But the premise of the show was there was this pair of best friends and single moms, one black, portrayed by Thelma Hopkins, who is widowed with 2 sons, and the other one white, who is divorced with 2 daughters, played by Cindy Williams. They are also co-workers who are social workers for the Department of Social Services in Chicago. They decided to pool their resources and buy a house together in a suburban neighborhood in Illinois, close to where both of their families live. Merlin was cast in the role as one of the sons named Marcus. But taking on this role meant Merlin needed to relocate from New York to Los Angeles. So at this time, not only was Merlin transitioning from one side of the country to the other, but he was also making that often difficult transition from child actor into adult actor. For the most part, Merlin was able to sidestep most of the things that young actors get too caught up in, and much of that can certainly be attributed to a pretty strict upbringing by his mother, who, when he was a child, Merlin was said to be more afraid of than the drug dealers and gangbangers on the streets of the neighborhood in which he grew up. And that seemed to have carried over with him when he came out to LA. Merlin stayed away from trouble, and he settled down in North Hollywood, considered to be a relatively quiet area in the valley. Even though getting by only lasted a little more than a year, Merlin continued to work steadily, hanging in there until he finally got the role that he would be best known for, Romeo Santana, on The Steve Harvey Show, and he stayed with the show for its entire 6-season run. And acting wasn't all that Merlin was interested in. He also aspired to becoming a musician, his interest focused on rap music. When he wasn't working on his TV shows, he was spending time working on developing his first album. And this introduced him to a whole new set of friends and acquaintances, one of whom had a small recording studio in his home in an area of Los Angeles known as the Crenshaw District. And the Crenshaw District had a history similar to where Merlin grew up, a neighborhood that had been overrun by gangs and drugs in the 80s and 90s, but had seen a tremendous amount of improvement going into the 2000s. But at the time this story takes place, it continued to have somewhat of a negative reputation because of its history. So this is where Merlin is spending his free time, working on his music with hopes of one day releasing an album of his own. So what transpires next? There are a few different accounts of what happened. And I can't say with 100% certainty which account is the most accurate. So I will tell you all of them, but when all is said and done, the end result will be the same. It all started on the night of Friday, November 8th, 2002. Merlin was hanging out with his friend, another child star named Brandon Adams. He's the friend who had the house in Crenshaw with the recording studio. There are going to be 2 Brandons in this story, so I'll try the best I can to keep them straight as we go along here. So Brandon Adams, he appeared in films such as People Under the Stairs, The Mighty Ducks, which also starred our old friend Jussie Smollett, The Sandlot, and D2, The Mighty Ducks, and in television he appeared on Quantum Leap, A Different World, Martin, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Boy Meets World, Sister Sister, in addition to a handful of other shows. So the 2 of them were hanging out on this Friday night doing whatever it is 20-something friends do. On this particular weekend, Merlin wasn't even supposed to be in LA. He had plans to go to New York to visit with his family, but he ended up postponing that visit at the last minute because of an audition. Now, I read in a couple of places that once the Steve Harvey Show ended that same year in 2002, it was earlier in the year, that Merlin may have been struggling to find what he was going to do next. On his IMDb, he had about 6 or 7 projects that he had completed in 2002, once the Steve Harvey Show wrapped, but nothing yet that was going to be long-term or a recurring role. Merlin was only 26 years old, so he was definitely an up-and-comer. Something would have panned out for him. If not with his acting career right away, he still had his interest in music to fall back on. So I can't imagine that he was feeling that lost or downtrodden about his career just yet. But I'm sure it was hard to walk away from a show that he really enjoyed being a part of for 6 seasons. But anyway, that weekend, travel plans canceled. Merlin stayed in LA and he's hanging out with his friend Brandon. They ended up recording a few music tracks, and then sometime around midnight, they decided to call up this girl that they had met a couple nights before while they were out to eat. She told them that her name was Mercedes, and when she met Merlin, she recognized him from his role as Romeo on the Steve Harvey Show. So apparently this girl was a little bit starstruck, and she wanted to talk to Merlin and get to know him. And it's been said that he may have took it as a nice compliment that she knew who he was, so he wanted to talk to her too. So she gave them her number and they parted ways. And it was on this night, on Friday the 8th, that Brandon and Merlin decided to call her to see if she wanted to come over and hang out, to which she agreed. When she got to Brandon's house, what neither he nor Merlin knew was that Mercedes had been dropped off by a couple of other young men, a guy named Damian Gates and his friend Brandon Bynes. While Mercedes was there, Merlin and Brandon kind of noticed that she was behaving kind of strangely. She's not really seeming to be able to relax. She's kind of pacing around the house, looking kind of shifty, kind of dodgy, kind of cagey. Now this is where the story sort of diverges into 2 different directions. The first account is that Mercedes, who seemed kind of nervous, eventually got on her phone, and when she was done, she told Merlin and Brandon that she had to go. And this caused Brandon to be a little bit suspicious of her, like, hey, what's up with this girl, right? So he went outside, and I guess he may have either watched where she went or walked somewhat in the same direction as her to see if he could figure out what she was up to. But then he saw her get into an SUV, and he could see that there were at least 2 other people in that vehicle. So when she got in, they drove away just about a block or so up the street and then parked again. So Brandon went back inside the house and told Merlin about Mercedes getting into that car and going up the street and pulling over, and he didn't like it, and it made him nervous, like this was some sort of setup. The first account of the story involves there having been a sexual encounter between Mercedes and Merlin sometime prior to this night, about a day earlier. And when she showed up at their place that night, she was getting kind of the cold shoulder from him, that she didn't like the way that he was treating her. And this is 1 day later, so that something about that set her off, causing her to leave. The second account is that either Merlin or Merlin and Brandon both did have a sexual encounter with her that night, and when they were done, she got on the phone and left shortly afterwards, getting into the SUV. Well, one of the men in that car was Damian Gates, and he was her boyfriend. And she had apparently told him that either Merlin or Brandon or both of them raped her or tried to rape her, and this caused him to become very angry. The police have also theorized that this whole entire thing was a setup put together by the 3 of them to perhaps rob Merlin and Brandon or to burglarize their home. But those plans never came to fruition when Mercedes went back to the SUV with the story about being assaulted. But anyway, Brandon didn't think it was a good idea to stay in the house like a sitting duck, so they decided to take off. Merlin and Brandon got into Brandon's car. Merlin was in the passenger seat. And just as Brandon started the car and was about to back up, he glanced into his rearview mirror, at which point he saw 2 men sort of walking fast or jogging towards them and their car. It was dark outside, but he could see that they had their arms held up straight in front of them in the way that you would if you were pointing a gun at someone. Not only that, he could see that there was a red laser sight that was reflecting in his mirror as well. One of these men was holding a handgun, and the other was holding an assault rifle. Brandon immediately yelled at Merlin to get down just as these 2 opened fire on their vehicle. As soon as the gunfire stopped, Brandon drove off, but soon he realized that Merlin was slumped in the seat next to him. A large amount of blood was coming from the back of his head. Brandon pulled over, and it just so happened that police were passing by, which Brandon was able to flag down to try to get some help. But there was nothing that could be done. The large .30 caliber bullet had struck Merlin in the back of the head, killing him instantly. And this bullet, dreamers, it's like one of those magical JFK bullets whose trajectory seems to defy probability. 9 casings were recovered from the scene where the shooting took place. But this one bullet, it entered into Brandon's car through the trunk. It penetrated the back seat. It somehow shifted its direction, penetrated the passenger side headrest, and entered Merlin's head. It was the unluckiest of shots. Just one of those freak 1 in a million chances, I guess. I don't know, maybe not if you're using an assault rifle in a neighborhood, I suppose. You're likely to strike something. Investigators collected Merlin's cell phone to check his last call. It was to Mercedes. Brandon told the police about their encounter with her and how she came over for just a few minutes, acted weird, then left. This, of course, had investigators interested. Later on that same morning, as Brandon was still at the police station, detectives asked him if he would call Mercedes and ask her if they could meet up. And she agreed to do so. And it may surprise you, as she willingly showed up to meet with Brandon, but at that point, she was arrested by detectives who were waiting for her. It's the day after the man that she was with shot somebody, and she didn't stop to think about that. Like, why is this guy calling me to meet with him so soon after this violent encounter? Well, detectives in speaking to her thought that Mercedes came across as pretty street smart, which is why I was kind of surprised that she was so willing to meet up with Brandon. But at the time, Mercedes was only 15 years old, so there's still going to be shades of gullibility there. And from the time that she sat down in the interrogation room, it was one lie after another after another. She lied about her name, she lied about her age, she lied about her address, just everything. She told police that she was 21, and they were like, okay, she looks like she could be 21, but far from it. Eventually, after some time, investigators were finally able to get to the truth. That this girl was 15 years old and her real name was Monique King. She already had a record, and at the time that this happened, she was a runaway from a juvenile detention center. But she really wasn't talking beyond that. However, when they looked at her cell phone and her call logs, that's when the name Damian Gates came up. And he, too, was soon arrested at his house, and it was searched, and at the time, they found bullets that turned out to be an exact match to the bullets found at the scene of the shooting, to the bullet that killed Merlin. Brandon Bynes was also present at his house at the time that police came to arrest him, so he was taken into custody as well, suspected of being the second shooter. But what often happens in cases like this is Damian Gates and Brandon Bynes decided to point the finger at each other as being the shooter. I mentioned earlier that one of them was holding a handgun and the other was holding an assault rifle, and it was a bullet from the assault rifle that killed Merlin. And in her statement to police, Monique said that it was Damian who was holding the assault rifle when the two of them got out of the vehicle to head back towards the location where Merlin and Brandon were. From that, police were able to infer that it was in fact Damian Gates who fired the fatal shot. And the motive behind the shooting all came down to Monique King. She was the one who set this whole thing in motion. If not for her, none of this would have ever happened, and Merlin Santana would be alive today. For whatever reasons, when Monique went back to that SUV that night, she told Damian, who was 21 years old at the time, and her boyfriend, that Merlin and Brandon either attempted to rape her or they did rape her, one or both of them. and this caused him to become enraged to the point where he decided he would deal with this using his rifle. And his friend Brandon Bynes went along to help. Later on, however, Monique King would recant that accusation, stating that she lied to Damien about being assaulted. So that means that these two men were provoked into killing Merlin over a story that wasn't even true. So why? Why would Monique do something like that? Well, clearly this young woman has already had a messed up life as it is, and it isn't going to get any better anytime soon. But the reasons she did this really depend on which version of what happened between her and Merlin and her and Brandon actually happened. If the first scenario is accurate, the one where she had a sexual encounter the day prior, and when she showed up for the second get-together, she was not taking well to the manner in which Merlin was treating her or acting towards her, and that just set off something in her own mind, causing her to want to leave right away and have her boyfriend handle it. But I'm sure she couldn't exactly tell him that she had a consensual sexual encounter with Merlin, right? Because she has this boyfriend. So in order to get back at Merlin for snubbing her the night after they had sex, she needed to say something drastic in order to get the reaction she wanted out of her boyfriend. So she tells him that she was assaulted. Now, if the second scenario is closer to the truth, then she went to the house. Perhaps she was casing the joint, looking to set them up for a robbery and a burglary, and maybe she got nervous and backed out. Maybe one of them, either Brandon or Merlin, did make a sexual advance. Maybe something did happen between her and one of them. It's really hard to say, but the theory I had thought may have been what likely happened is that a sexual encounter of some sort happened and Monique needed to cover it up, so she decided to tell her boyfriend that she was assaulted. Or perhaps even she wanted a sexual encounter to occur, but she was rejected, causing her to become upset, and she went and told her boyfriend that she was assaulted. Whatever the case was, we will never know for sure, because she's never said. But what we do know is that she later admitted that she was not assaulted, that it was a lie that she told her boyfriend, which ultimately led to the shooting. Whether or not anything happened between Merlin and Monique, we simply don't know. All we know is whatever it was she said to Damien was enough for him to bring an assault rifle to the fight. Of this case, police would say that there did not seem to be any reason why Monique would tell her boyfriend that Merlin assaulted her. But I tend to believe that there was probably a reason, that he did something or said something that she didn't like, or that she needed a cover story for having a sexual encounter with him. I do believe that she lied to Merlin and Brandon about her age. I don't think that they realized that Monique King was only 15 years old at the time that this happened. All three suspects, Damien Gates, Brandon Bynes, and Monique King, were charged with murder. In March of 2004, Gates, the man who shot the fatal bullet, was convicted of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences plus 70 years. Today, Damien Gates is 38 years old and currently being housed at the Correctional Training Facility in Soledad, California. He will become eligible for parole in November of 2026. According to his inmate page, Gates is eligible for a parole hearing as a youthful offender because he committed his offense while under the age of 26. His first parole being set in 2026 is based on the sentence that he was given. So there is a chance that someday Merlin's killer could walk free. It's unlikely, but possible. He's young, so he's got a long road ahead of him. 2 months before Damien Gates was convicted, in January of 2004, his accomplice Brandon Bynes pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and assault with a deadly weapon. On March 11, 2004, Bynes was sentenced to 23 years in prison. And according to my California inmate search, he is no longer incarcerated today. And as for Monique, well, she elected to have a bench trial, and she was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder and attempted murder. She was tried as an adult, but since she was only 15 when Merlin was murdered, she could have been sentenced to a maximum of 10 years in a juvenile facility to be released when she turned 25. But she was sentenced to 8 years, and in my inmate search for her today, she too is not in any correctional facility in California at this time. Monique King is the young woman that Jazz Waters encountered the first night that she spent in jail when she was arrested for embezzling money from her boss. The girl who was laying on the bench in the holding cell crying. The one who Jazz found out from the others in the holding cell that not only was this young girl HIV positive, not only was she facing attempted murder charges stemming from that diagnosis, but she was also the woman who had Merlin Santana set up. At least, that's what Jazz said in her segment on the Brilliant Idiots podcast. She was referring to him by his name on the Steve Harvey show. Jazz was talking about Merlin. Nobody in that holding cell had sympathy for Monique. Though Jazz, even if it was for a moment before she found out who this girl actually was, Jazz did have sympathy. A part of her even thought that Monique may have even needed a hug. Indeed, she probably needed lots of hugs, but also much, much more than that, long before she ever ended up in that cell with Jazz and company. But for a fleeting moment, and perhaps even more so than that, Jazz felt for her. But, once that woman next to her said, she's the one who set up Merlin Santana to be killed, Jazz had to let it go. She needed to do what she needed to do to get through her own situation. So, I guess, once someone else is in jail tells you something like that bitch is done, then it's best to just let that go. Jazz may have been that one person to have given Monique a hug if she could have, though I seriously doubt that she would have been allowed to. Monique King was a very lost soul, starting from pretty early on. I don't know what happened to her early in life that led her into so many difficult situations in her teen years, having been a runaway, getting involved with this older man who clearly has a temper and a penchant for violence, and then into a life where she needed to support herself through sex work when she was released from prison after having served her time for her role in Merlin's murder. Jazz estimated Monique to be about 19 or 20 years old. That means at least 4 to 5 years had passed since Merlin's murder. She had already been arrested at least one prior time before Jazz's encounter with her, which is when she found out to have been HIV positive. So based on Jazz's guess as to how old Monique was, I could only guess that this time, when they were both in that holding cell at the same time, this took place around 2006 or 2007, since we know Monique was 15 when Merlin was murdered. So if she was 15 in 2002, that means today, wherever she is, she's only 33. I don't have any information as to what happened to this young woman prior to Merlin's death, nor do I have any information as to where she's at today. As for Jazz, well, after I shared with you the story she shared on the podcast, I told you that her story wasn't over yet. But let me share with you some of her tweets. It's kind of interesting to look back at her pattern of tweeting, as in the fall of 2019, it was a little bit sporadic. She sent a tweet on September 17th, but was quiet until October 6th when she finally tweeted, "I'm in a really dark and lonely place right now. I've had my head so fucked with that I don't know what's what. And I know this is Twitter and you're not supposed to say anything real or vulnerable, but maybe someone else out there feels really lost and will know that it's not just them. Jazz then sent out a small flurry of tweets on October 11th. Tweets that said in part, "I'm so grateful for everyone that continues to share their stories with me or found courage within my courage and reached out for their own lifelines. Depression, anxiety, etc. None of it makes you weak. It makes you human, and admitting it can eventually make you better. Life happens to all of us. If you don't fail at something, it's only because you're not trying. Or even the best of intentions can trigger a catastrophe. Or things don't go your way. Or you get tired of fighting. Whatever triggers your dark place, know it's not just you." Thank you to everyone who reached out with words of encouragement, a friendly ear, or simply sent kind thoughts my way. I truly appreciate it. Truly. It's probably my most vulnerable tweet, but also my most important. I'm winging it like everyone else, but I'm also learning. On October 13th, Jazz tweeted, "Spoiler, your soulmate is you." On October 21st, she tweeted, "Grateful for another year. Thank you for the birthday wishes." Then Jazz went silent on Twitter for the next 160 days. She would come back to Twitter on March 29th, 2020, as the country was in a full lockdown and quarantine. She tweeted, "There's opportunity in the unknown, and the only one that can tell you no is you. Give in, control the panic, connect, then decide what to do with the time and space we've all been given. That's my advice. Oh, and wash your fucking hands." On that day, Jazz sent out a total of 9 tweets after 5 months of silence. On March 30th, Jazz tweeted 2 words, "Creative strangulation." On March 31st, she tweeted, "Quarantine day, who knows? My dog sucks at conversation." Another tweet that day, she said, "Wild pitch, Groundhog's Day, but in a pandemic." And another, "Quarantine time." The next day, April 1st, 2020, Jazz tweeted, "This pandemic has taught me how poorly I hold my alcohol." The next couple of tweets were some dishes that she made, as well as a collage of selfies, and by the way, Jazz is quite a stunningly beautiful woman. Over the next few days, Jazz seemed to be counting, at least in some part of the quarantine days. She seems a little bit off, but at this time she says about day 15 or so. She puts up some retweets, a few joking tweets, some lighthearted ones, and more food pictures. She had a flurry of tweets on April 3rd. And on the 4th, she tweeted, "I'm never drinking again today." Another tweet, "Every day is both Monday and Saturday." On April 5th, Jazz tweeted, "I want my dog to wake up so I can show him his picture. Day 17. Another tweet, "If you haven't completely lost your shit, did you even pandemic?" On April 7th, Jazz tweeted, "Does anyone need groceries? For real. Things are really tough, confusing, what the fuck right now. So, if it helps, the first 5 people to respond with their Cash App, I got you. No questions asked. Stay encouraged. We'll get through this." Another tweet that day, "Stay encouraged, please." On April 8th, Jazz posted a 16-second video of herself. Sounds like she's tapping her fingernails, and then she says, "Dinner and scene work." Throughout her various tweets, Jazz is also working on a script for a project, though she doesn't specify what it's for. On April 14th, she tweeted, "The hardest part about writing right now is giving myself over to a fictional story when the biggest, most dramatic story is happening in real life." On April 15th, she said, "Spent the last hour doing yard work instead of spiraling. That's it. That's today's victory." Jazz had a series of somewhat cryptic tweets over the next few days. Then on April 20th, she tweeted, "I wonder what my next life will be like." Then she had a few more food posts, followed by a tweet on April 22nd that read, "I'm in hell." On April 24th, Jazz tweeted, "I'm tired of sheltering in place with my anxiety. Most days are nearly debilitating. Hence, the cooking simply for the calming that it brings. So if you're struggling, just to keep the fear of the unknown in check, know that you are not alone. I am with you." Another tweet read, "If no one talks about real shit, nothing ever changes. Every house has a different pandemic. The family of 5 in a 2-bedroom whose income just dropped. The family that lost all their elders. Or the single person just worried about their job. We're all going through it. Let it out." April 27th. I cut my hair. And you know what they say, when a woman cuts her own hair, she's in an unprecedented worldwide pandemic. On April 28th, just called my dog a liar, day 51. On April 29th, Jazz posted a thread. "So I've been thinking all morning about #MeToo. Is it over? Did we really solve anything? Did it extend beyond cameras, industries, race, class? Do we, both men and women, support accusers/victims unlike us? Did we learn anything? This is what I'm asking myself. So far, many of the answers need to stick with me right now. But one I wanted to share with you is to empower the women in your lives. Empower us to expect to feel safe, feel worth, feel seen, feel heard, feel valued. Reaffirm us from birth until our last breath. All of us. It builds a safe space for women to share when, not if, inappropriate behavior occurs, and it retrains all of us to listen without judgment to what she is saying. Abusers thrive in the silence, not only created by them, but also by spaces built to disempower women." On May 7th, Jazz tweeted, "Anxiety through the roof. So you know what that means? More cooking." And then she posted a series of dishes that she made for the first time. Also on May 7th, she tweeted, "Some shit just changes you." And that was the last tweet Jazz Waters ever sent. If you tap onto the comments, you will quickly realize that Jazz is gone. On June 9th, 2020, a little more than a month after her anxiety through the roof tweet, Jazz took her own life by hanging. She was only 39 years old. In a way, this particular episode of our show, this has been a story within a story. I wrote this in one day. Yesterday, as I'm recording this, Monday, it was Labor Day here in the United States. But now, as I wind this down, it is now the next day, exactly 12:59 a.m. as I type this. For me, the story started off first with Merlin. I came across his tragic death in an article that I was reading just after I finished recording the episode before this, Brother versus Brother. And as I began looking deeper into Merlin's story, I found Jazz's story. And I didn't find out about her having taken her own life right away, even when I began listening to her on that podcast, because I was linked to her through Monique King and how that encounter happened in the county jail. Eventually, I came to find out that Jazz, sadly, was no longer alive. And then, over this last weekend, a thing happened on social media that, for a minute, had me questioning whether or not I should even tell this story. But I quickly pushed those doubts aside because I really felt so much of what Jazz had shared in her interview and on her Twitter. Her words resonated with me, especially listening to her, and then re-listening after finding out that she was no longer with us. I've been hanging onto every syllable this entire 3-day weekend. And this Monday morning, I just sat down and started typing. Even though somebody in our Facebook group suggested that as a quote-unquote white woman, which I clarified, I am not just a white woman. If you feel comfortable enough to get on the discussion page and suggest that white women need to stay in their lanes, then you should be very well aware of that fact by now that I am not just a white woman. Stay in my lane. Nobody, and I'm pretty confident when I say this, nobody wants to listen to a white woman, or a white man for that matter, exclusively talk about crimes or stories involving only white women or white men. If they did that, they would be accused of excluding or being narrow-minded. It's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If I stayed in my lane, do you realize how many episodes of our show would have to be scrapped? Starting all the way back to episodes 1 and 2, both of them involving the Korean community. Episode 4, the killer was Filipino. Episode 5, the killer was Hispanic. Episode 8, he was black. In 9, the killer was technically a dog. So what, I can't tell a story with a measure of understanding because I can't relate to being a fighting dog? Episode 13, one of the perpetrators was Romanian. We've covered Ariel Castro, the Los Angeles riots, the beating of Rodney King, Gwen Araujo in episode 61, she was trans and Hispanic, Blaze Bernstein, Suge Knight, Ennis Cosby, Kiki Camarena, he was the DEA agent murdered in Mexico, Marcus Wesson, Brian Banks, Maribel Ramos, the Zoot Suit riots, death row inmates Kevin Cooper and Rodney Reed, Alan Schindler, the sailor who was murdered because he was gay, the murders of Tamisha Ridge, Crystal Taylor, Robert Ayala, Gilbert Fernandez, Michelle Lee, Lawrence, also known as Leticia King, Elijah Diaz, all people of color, Matthew Shepard. And the case that spawned this whole conversation about swerving out of my lane, Jussie Smollett. And now, today's story too, if you want to get technical about it. None of these communities do I belong to, and over the course of more than 3 years has this ever been an issue brought up, because we're all about the crime and the story. That is, until this weekend. Maybe I'm not the right person to tell every single story out there, but I'm not trying to. All I'm really interested in is sharing these unique and intriguing tales of true crime. So if you want to tell me to stay in my lane, this might not be the podcast for you. But good luck to you finding a podcast that excludes every single group and community except for the one that you belong to. Merlin Santana was black. Jazz Waters was black too. But tell me, did you not feel what Jazz had to say? You don't have to be black to get it. You also don't ever have to have been arrested, or have embezzled money, or been a staff writer on a TV show, or love to cook, or suffer from anxiety, or have suicidal ideation. You don't have to be any of that to feel what she had to say, because she was so much more than that one thing. She was more than just her race. Was she an important figure in the black community? Of course she was. Did me telling her story diminish that? In my humble opinion, I don't think it did one bit. If anything, I bet you learned something new today, because I know I did. As I typed that, it was 1:47 in the morning, and it became time for me to wrap up this episode of California Dreaming. I would encourage you to come over to our Facebook discussion group if you haven't done so and request to join. It's there we discuss these cases and share our thoughts and opinions, not only about this show, but whatever other podcasts that you listen to. And if you listened to last week's episode, there's a pretty interesting discussion going on right now about twins and identical twins. So come on over. I'd love to hear from you. You can also go over to the show's Facebook page and like that page and leave a review or a recommendation. You can also follow us on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to, with an amazing roster of shows with content including true crime, history, sports, entertainment, gaming, and social media. So visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You will find links to all of our podcasts as well as a direct link to our merchandise store on TeePublic. Again, that's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. It would be the responsible thing for me to tell you listening that if you're struggling with anxiety or depression, to share with you the plethora of resources out there that are just a phone call or a mouse click away. But sometimes that's not enough, and you all already know all that. The one thing I saw over and over again in the comments on Jazz's Twitter under her final tweet, aside from the sorrow and the condolences, was the regret that nobody recognized her cries for help. It's the reason I shared the progression of her tweets the final months of her life. So, as important as it is to know the resources that are out there for you, it's also important for us to notice those reaching for a lifeline. We can see that now in Jazz's tweets. We know what that looks like. And I think we need to be proactive. I've called the police before on someone I didn't know in a Facebook group who was clearly in crisis and needed help. That person ended up being really mad that I did that, but I would have preferred that to anything else. And that's all I'm saying. Just take notice. Thank you again so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne. Until next time, sweet dreams.